Cur Deus Homo, or Why God Was Made Man, by St. Anselm, sometime Archbishop of Canterbury. A treatise showing the redemption of mankind through the atonement made by the incarnate Son of God, to be consistent both with divine justice and mercy, and also with the reason of man. Related with an introduction containing some account of the author and an analysis of the work by a clergyman, that he might be just and justifier of him which believeth in Jesus. Romans 3:26. Author's Preface. This work having been counterfeited by some persons who, without my knowledge, copied out for themselves the first parts of it, before it had been completed and corrected, I have been compelled to finish it off as I best could, with more haste than was convenient to me, and so more brevity than I could wish, since there are many more things which I have passed over in silence, that I should have put in and appended to the work, had liberty been given me of bringing it out in quiet and at its proper season. For it was in great tribulation of heart, and from whom and why I suffered this, God knows, that I commenced it, and when requested to do so in England, and completed it while an exile in the province of Capua. I have called it Cur Deus Homo, after the subject matter, for the explanation of which it is published, and have divided it into 2 short books. The first book contains the objections of unbelievers who reject the Christian faith because they think it contrary to reason, and then Christ being put out of the question as though nothing of him had ever been, it is proved by necessary reasons that it is impossible for any man to be saved without him. Similarly, in the second book, as though nothing concerning Christ were known, it is shown by no less clear reasoning and truth that human nature was constituted to the end that the whole man, that is both in body and soul, might enjoy some time in blessed immortality, and that this end for which man was created must be effected by man, but it cannot except through a man-God. And so it follows of necessity that all the things which we believe concerning Christ must take place. This little preface, together with the heads of the whole book, I beg all who wish to copy out this book to preface before the commencement of it, so that into whosoever hands it may fall, he may see at a glance on its forefront, so to speak, whether there be anything in the whole body of the work which he should regard with attention. Cur Deus Homo, Book 1, Chapter 1. The question on which the whole matter depends. I have been oftentimes and very earnestly requested by many, both by word of mouth and by letter, to commit to writing, so that they may be remembered, the reasons for certain points of our faith which I am in the habit of giving to those who inquire of me. For they say they are pleased with them, and they think they are satisfied by them. And they request this of me, not that they may by reasoning attain to faith, but that they may derive pleasure by understanding and meditating on those things they already believe, and also may be, as far as possible, ready always to satisfy anyone who asketh a reason of the hope that is in us. The question which unbelievers who deride the simplicity of Christianity as foolish are accustomed to object to us, and which many of the faithful turn over in their minds, is this, namely, what reason or necessity was there for God to have been made man, and by his death, as we believe and confess, to have restored life to the world, whereas he might have done this either by another person, an angel or a man, or by a mere act of his own will. Of this question, not only learned, but even many unlearned men seek and wish to find the solution, since therefore many desire a treatise on it, and although in the inquiry it may seem very difficult, yet in the solution it is intelligible to all. And besides, the task is pleasing on account of its usefulness and beauty of the reasoning, notwithstanding too that sufficient has been said upon it by the Holy Fathers, yet still I will take pains to make clear to inquirers what God has designed to unfold to me on the subject. And since that which is sifted by question and answer is made more clear to many, and especially the less acute intellects, and on that account is more acceptable to them, I shall, out of those who discuss this question, take one who very strongly urges me to commence this work as disputing with me, so that Boso may question and Anselm may answer thus. Chapter 2. How what is about to be said here is to be received. Boso. As due order requires that we should believe the deep things of the Christian faith before we presume to discuss them by our reason, so it appears to me a neglect of duty if after that we are established in the faith, we do not take pains to understand what we believe. Wherefore, since by the grace of God preventing me, I think I hold so firmly the faith of our redemption, that even were I unable to comprehend by any reasoning what I believe, still nothing would be able to tear me from its firm basis. For this very reason, I beg of you to explain to me what, as you know, many inquire of me, namely, what necessity or reason was there that God, since he is omnipotent, should have taken upon himself the lowliness and infirmity of human nature in order to its restoration? Anselm. What you ask of me is far beyond me, and on this account I am afraid of treating of things which are too high for me, lest haply someone, when he has fancied or even perceived that I do not satisfy him, should imagine that the truth of the fact was lacking to me, rather than that my understanding was insufficient to grasp it. Boso. You ought not to be afraid of this, but on the contrary to remember that it frequently happens in discoursing on any question that God unfolds what he had before concealed, though you ought also to trust in the grace of God, that if you freely impart what you have freely received, you will be counted worthy to receive those higher things which you have not yet attained to. Anselm. There is also another cause for which I see that it will be hardly possible, if at all, to treat fully on this matter which is before us. For to do so, it is necessary to have a knowledge of the nature of power, necessity, will, and certain other things which are so circumstanced that no one of them can be considered fully without the others. And to treat them thus requires a work of itself, not very easy, as it seems to me, and yet not altogether useless, for ignorance about them makes some things difficult, which by knowledge become easy. Boso. On these points you can speak briefly in their proper place, so that we may have what shall suffice for the present work, and what more to be said we may defer to another time. Anselm. There is another consideration which makes me draw back very much from your request. The subject is not only of great importance, but in that it is of one in excellence more exalted than the sons of men, so also it requires reasoning exalted above the intellect of men. For this reason I am afraid lest, even as I am often indignant and unskillful artists when I see our Lord himself painted with a deformed figure, so it may happen to myself if I presume to deface so glorious a subject with an uncultivated and contemptible style of speaking. Boso. Yet not even this ought to deter you, because as you allow anyone who can to say the things in a better manner, so you do not prevent anyone who is displeased with your style from writing in more polished language. But that I may cut short all your excuses, I ask you to do this, not for the learned, but for me, and those who make the request with thee. Anselm. Well, since I see your importunity, and theirs who with you make this request out of charity and pious zeal, I will try to the utmost of my power, by the help of God in your prayers, which you who ask this of me have to this end often promised me, not so much to show you what you are in search of as to search with you. I wish, however, all that I say be received on these terms, namely, that if I shall have made any statement unconfirmed by a greater authority, although I may seem to have proved it by reason, yet that it be not received with any other certainty than that it appears to me at present to be thus, until God show it me more clearly to be otherwise. because if I shall have been in some measure able to answer your question satisfactorily, it ought to follow as a certainty that one wiser than I am would be able to do this more fully. Nay, it must be allowed that whatever any man is able to say or know on the subject, yet higher reasons for so great a thing still remain undiscovered.
Bozo. And therefore to be discovered, to use the words of unbelievers, it is right that, when we study to inquire a reason for our faith, we should bring forward the objections of those who are by no means willing to come to the same faith without reason. For although they ask for a reason, because they do not believe, and we because we do, yet it is one and the same thing which we ask. And if you make any answer which sacred authority appears to oppose, I am at liberty to bring it forward, so that you may explain how it does not really oppose.
Anselm, say what you think fit. Chapter 3. The objections of unbelievers and the answers of the faithful.
Bozo. Unbelievers who scoff at our simplicity object to us that we do God an injury and insult when we assert that he came down into the womb of the Virgin, that he was born of a woman, and that he grew up on the nourishment of milk and man's food, and not to speak of many other things which do not seem befitting the deity. He underwent weariness, hunger, thirst, stripes, and the cross, and death between the thieves.
Anselm, we do not do God any injury or insult, but we give him thanks with all our heart. We praise and we publish the unspeakable depth of his mercy, in that so wonderfully and beyond conception, out of so many and great and deserved evils under which we lay, he has restored us to so many and great undeserved good things that we had lost, and has thus manifested his greater love and goodness toward us. For if they would diligently consider how fitting it is that the restoration of man should be brought about in this way, they would not scoff at our simplicity, but would praise with us the wisdom and goodness of God. Since it was right that, as by man's disobedience death passed upon the human race, so by the obedience of man should life be restored. And like a sin which was the cause of our condemnation had its beginning from a woman, so the author of our righteousness and salvation be born of a woman. And as the devil by the tasting of a tree overcame man, whom he persuaded to it, so by the passion on the tree which he brought about, should he be overcome by man. There are also many other things which, when carefully considered, manifest the unspeakable harmony of our redemption effected in this way. Chapter 4. That these answers appear to unbelievers not of necessary consequence, and as it were, mere pictures.
Bozo. All these things, it must be allowed, are beautiful, and like certain pictures, but if there be not something solid on which they rest, they do not seem to satisfy unbelievers why we ought to believe that it was God's will to suffer what we say he did. For he who makes a painting chooses some solid substance on which to paint, so that what he paints may endure. For no one paints on water or on air, because on them no traces of the picture would remain. Wherefore, when we put forward these coincidences which you mention, they are to unbelievers but pictures of facts, since they are of opinion that it is not a real fact, but a mere figment that we believe. And think we, as it were, paint upon a cloud. There must, therefore, first be shown a reasonable foundation of faith, that is to say, a necessity, which may prove that it was right, or even possible for God to humble himself to those things which we have before mentioned, and then that the body, as it were, of truth may be more beautiful. These coincidences may be set forth as colorings to the body.
Anselm, does it not seem a sufficiently necessary reason why God should do what we say he did, when we consider that the whole human race, that so precious work of his, was utterly lost, that it was not fitting that what God had purposed for man should come entirely to an end, and that same purpose of his could not be effected unless the human race was set free by its creator himself. Chapter 5. That the redemption of man could not be effected by any other than by the person of God.
Bozo. This same deliverance, if it could in any way be said to have been effected by any other than the person of God, whether either by an angel or a man, the human mind would much more readily receive it. For God was able to make a man without sin, not intending from the sinful lump of fallen nature, nor from any man, but like as he made Adam, and by such an one it would seem he might have effected the same work.
Anselm. Do you not perceive that if any other man were to redeem a man from eternal death, the redeemed man would be rightly judged to be his servant? And if this had so happened, man would by no means have been restored to that dignity which would have been his had he not sinned. Since he who would otherwise have been servant to none but God, and equal to the angels in all things, would thus become servant to the one who was not God, and to whom the angels were not subject.
Bozo. This is what they wonder at so much, that we call this redemption our deliverance. For say they, in what captivity, in what prison, in what power were you held, from which God could not have delivered you, except by redeeming with such labors, and at last with his own blood? And when we tell them he redeemed us from our sins, from his own wrath, from hell, and from the power of the devil, whom he came to fight and conquer for us, because we were unable to do so ourselves, he also repurposed for us the kingdom of heaven. And by doing all this in this manner, he shows us how much he loved us. When we tell them this answer, they answer, if you say that God, who you tell us created all things by a word, was unable to do all this by a simple command, you refute yourselves by making him not almighty. Or if you confess that he was able but not willing to do it, except in this way, how will you show him to be wise, whom you affirm to have suffered without any reason things so unbefitting him? For all these things which you bring forward depend upon his will. For the wrath of God is nothing else than his will to punish. If therefore he does not will to punish the sins of men, man is free from his sins, from the wrath of God, from hell, and from the power of the devil. All which things he suffers on account of his sins. He also receives what he was deprived of on account of the same sins. For in whose power is hell, or the devil, or whose is the kingdom of heaven, but his who made all things? Whatever things, therefore, you either dread or look forward to with longing, these are subject to his will, which nothing can resist. Wherefore, if he were unwilling to the human race should be saved, wherefore, if he were unwilling that the human race should be saved, except in that way which you speak, when he could do it by his simple will, see how, to say the least, you oppose his wisdom. For if a man were without any reason to do that with great labor, which he could have done with ease, he would certainly not be judged wise by anyone. For as much as you tell us that God has showed you how much he loved you, this is not to be defended with any reason, unless it be shown that man could not have been saved any other way. For if he could not in any other way, then perhaps there would have been a necessity for him to show his love in this way. But now, when he could have saved man in some other way, what reason is there that for the sake of showing his love, he should do and suffer what you say he did? Does he not then show to the good angels how much he loves them, though for them he does not suffer such things? And as to what you say of his coming to fight for you against the devil, with what sense dare you bring this forward? Does not God's omnipotence reign everywhere? How then, for the conquest of the devil, must God needs come down from heaven? These are what unbelievers seem able to object against us. but the other reason we are accustomed to give, to wit, that it was necessary for God, in order to deliver man, to contend against the devil by righteousness, before that he did so by might, so that, since the devil had slain him, in whom there was no cause of death, and who was God, he should justly lose that power which he had over sinners. Otherwise God would have done him an injustice, since he held possession of man justly, for he had not taken him captive by violence, but the said man had given himself up to him for his own accord. This argument, then, I do not see the force of, for if the devil or man had been their own, or had belonged to anyone else than God, or had remained in anyone else's power than God's, perhaps this argument might be rightly used. But when neither the devil nor man belong to anyone else but God, and out of the power of God neither of them exist, what cause is there for God of necessity to plead with his own, concerning his own, and in his own, but merely to punish his servant, who persuaded his fellow servant to forsake their common Lord, and go over to him as a traitor had received the runaway, as a thief a fellow thief, together with what he had stolen from his Lord? For each of them was a thief, since the one, at the other's persuasion, had stolen himself from his Lord. If God were to act thus, what could be done with greater justice? Or if God, the judge of all, were to take man, who is, as we see, his own possession, out of the power of one who so unjustly takes possession of him, whether for the purpose of punishing him in some other way than by the instrumentality of the devil, or for the purpose of sparing him, what injustice would there be in his, since, although it be just for man to be tormented by the devil, yet the devil would be unjust in tormenting him? Man indeed deserved to be punished, and by none more fitly than by him at whose persuasion he had consented to sin. But the devil never merited any right to punish him. Nay, he would do this with the greater degree of injustice, in that he was not drawn to it by any love of justice, but was impelled by the instinct of malice. For he did not do this at God's command, but in his incomprehensible wisdom, who ordereth well even evil things by God's permission. And I suppose that they who think that the devil had some just claims to the possession of man are led to this opinion, because they see it is just that man should be delivered to be tormented by the devil, and just that God should permit this, and on that account they suppose that it is just that the devil should bring that torment upon man. For it happens sometimes that the same thing viewed in different aspects is both just and unjust, and for this reason it is pronounced by those who do not closely look into it to be either altogether just or altogether unjust. For instance, it happens that a man strikes an innocent man unjustly, for which he justly deserves to be struck himself. Still, if the man struck ought not to avenge himself, and yet does strike the man who struck him, he does this unjustly. Since this blow on the part of him who refuses the blow is unjust, because he ought not to have avenged himself, but on the part of him who is struck it is just, because by unjustly striking another, he justly deserves to be struck himself. Therefore, in different aspects of the same action is both just and unjust, because it may happen to be pronounced entirely by one or entirely unjust by another. Hence, in this manner, the devil is said to torment man justly, because God permits this justly, and man suffers it justly. Here, however, where man is said to suffer justly, he is not said to suffer justly by reason of his own justice, but because he is punished by the just judgment of God. But if the handwriting of ordinances, which the apostle says was against us, and was blotted out by the death of Christ, be objected, and if anyone think that by that is meant that the devil might, by the handwriting of a certain agreement in justice, exact from man's sin as interest for that first sin to which he persuaded him, and also as the penalty for sin, so that by this he would seem to prove his just claims upon man, I by no means admit it to be so understood, for that handwriting is not the devil's, because it is called the handwriting of ordinances. But the ordinances are not the devil's, but God's, since by the just judgment of God they were ordained, and as it were confirmed by the handwriting, so that man who had willingly sinned could by himself avoid neither sin nor the penalty of sin, for he is a wind that passeth away and cometh not again, and he who committeth sin is a servant of sin. Neither ought he who sins to be let go unpunished, unless mercy spare the man, and set him free, and restore him. Wherefore we ought not to believe that by this handwriting can be discovered any just cause on the devil's part for his tormenting of man. In fact, it is as in a good angel there is no unrighteousness whatsoever, so in an evil angel there is no righteousness at all. There was therefore in the devil no righteous cause why God should not, for the deliverance of man, put forth his strength against him.
Anselm. The will of God ought to suffice for a reason why he does a thing, although we may not see why he so wills it, for the will of God is never unreasonable.
Bozo. That is true, if it be admitted that God did will the way in which it is done. Many, however, will by no means allow that God wills a thing, if it seem contrary to reason.
Anselm. What does there seem to you contrary to reason in our confessing that God willed those things which we believe in concerning his incarnation?
To speak briefly, it seems contrary to reason that the Most High should stoop to such humiliations, and that the Almighty should do anything with such toil and labor.
They who say this understand not what we believe, for the divine nature we assert without doubt to be impossible. Neither can it in any way be lowered from its loftiness, nor can anything which it wills to be a toil to it. Be a toil to it. But we say that our Lord Jesus Christ is very God and very man, one person in two natures, and two natures in one person. Wherefore, when we say that God suffered any humiliation or weakness, we do not understand this of the loftiness of his impassible nature, but of the infirmity of the human substance which he took. And thus it is manifest that reason in no way contradicts our faith. For in this we do not signify any humiliation of the divine substance, but we show that there is one person of God and man. In God's incarnation, therefore, no humiliation of his nature is understood to have taken place, but man's nature is believed to be exalted.
Be it so. Nothing then is to be taken as applied to the divine nature, which is said of Christ after the infirmity of his human nature. But still, how can it be proved just or reasonable for God to have allowed that man, whom the Father called his own beloved Son, in whom he was always well pleased, and whom the Son caused himself to be, so to treat himself and be treated by others? For what justice is there in delivering up to death instead of a sinner, a man of all men, the most just? What man would not be judged worthy of condemnation, if he were to condemn an innocent person, in order that he might set a guilty one free? The case is therefore reduced to the same degree of unfitness as was mentioned above. For if he were able to save sinners in no other way than by condemning a just man, where is his omnipotence? But if he were able but not unwilling, how shall we defend his wisdom and justice?
God the Father did not, in the way you seem to understand it, treat that man. Nor did he deliver to death an innocent person instead of a guilty one. For he did not compel him to die, or allow him to be slain under his will, but the same man himself underwent death of his own free will, that he might save man.
Well, though it were not against his will, since he consented to the will of the Father, yet in some sense he appears to have compelled him by commanding him to do it. For it is said that Christ humbled himself and became obedient to the Father unto death, even death on the cross, for which cause God hath all highly exalted him, and that he learned obedience by the things which he suffered, and that the Father spared not his own Son, but delivered him up for us all. And the same Son says, I came not to do mine own will, but the will of him that sent me. And when about to enter on his passion, he says, As the Father gave me commandment, even so I do. Also the cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? And elsewhere, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. And again, Father, if this cup may not pass away from me, except I drink it, thy will be done. In all these places, Christ appears to have undergone death rather from obedience compelling him, than from his own will disposing him to it.
You do not, I think, clearly distinguish between what he did from obedience requiring it, and what was done to him because he kept his obedience, which he underwent, though obedience did not require it.
I must have you explain this more clearly.
Why did the Jews persecute him even unto death?
For nothing else but that in his life and conversation he invariably held fast truth and justice.
And this, I suppose, because God requires it of every rational creature, which is bound to it from obedience to God.
So we must confess.
This obedience, therefore, that man owed to God the Father, and the human nature to the divine, and this the Father required of him.
No one doubts this.
Here, then, you have what he did from obedience requiring it.
True, and now I see that whatever was brought upon him because he persevered in obeying, he underwent. For death was brought upon him because he persisted in obedience, and this he underwent, but how obedience should not require this, I do not understand.
If man had never sinned, ought he to have suffered death, or ought God to have required death of him?
As we believe, man would neither have died, nor would death have been required of him. But I wish to hear from you the reason of this.
You do not deny that the rational creature was made just, and for this end, namely that it might be blessed with the enjoyment of God?
No, I admit that.
But you will not surely think it befitting God that he should compel, without any fault of its own, that to be miserable which he had made just, in order that it might be blessed. For a man to die against his will is to be miserable.
It is clear that if man had not sinned, God would not justly have required death of him.
God therefore did not compel Christ, in whom was no sin, to die, but he himself of his own will underwent death, not from obedience requiring him to forsake life, but because obedience required him to keep righteousness, in which he so constantly persevered, that by it he incurred death. It may also be said that the Father commanded him to die, since he commanded that by which he incurred death. Thus then, as the Father gave him commandment, even so he did, and the cup which he gave him, he drank, and he was made obedient to the Father unto death, and so learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. That is, he learned how far obedience should be kept. For the word which is used, he learned, may be understood in two senses. For he learned means either he made others to learn, or that he learned by experience that which by knowledge he was not ignorant of before. But when the apostle had said, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on the cross, he added, Wherefore God also hath highly exalted him, and given him a name which is above every name, similar to which is what David said, He shall drink of the brook in the way, therefore shall he lift up his head. This then is not so spoken as though he could in no way have attained that exaltation except by this obedience unto death, and that exaltation were conferred on him solely as a reward for this obedience. For before he had suffered, he said that all things had been delivered to him of his Father, and that all that the Father had were his. But since he himself, with the Father and the Holy Ghost, had ordained that he would not by his death display to the world the greatness of his power, when therefore what had been ordained to be no otherwise than by that death is done by it, it is not improperly said to be done on account of it. For if we intend to do a thing, but purpose to do something else first, by which the other might come to pass, when now that which we wished to precede it has been done, if what we intended takes place, it is rightly said to be done on account of this, since that which delayed its accomplishment has been done, because it had been purposed not to be accomplished except through the means of the latter. For instance, a river which I may cross either on horseback or by boat, I resolve that I will not cross except by boat, and on this account delay crossing, because the boat is not there. Now when the boat comes, if I cross, it is rightly said of me, the boat was ready, and therefore he crossed over. And when we speak thus, not only when it is by means of that which we resolved should precede it, but even when it is not by means of, but only after that we resolve to do anything else. For instance, if a man puts off taking food because he has not yet that day been to the celebration of the Holy Eucharist, when he has accomplished what he had made up his mind to do first, it is not improperly said to him, Take your food now, because you have done that for which you put off taking it. Far less strange a mode of expression is it when Christ is said to be exalted on account of having undergone death, by means of which and after which he had determined to bring about the exaltation. This may be understood also in the way in which we read that the same Lord increased in wisdom and favor with God, not that it was so literally, but that he so acted as if it had been so. For he was exalted after that death, as though he had been so on account of it. Again, he says, I came not to do mine own will, but the will of him that sent me. It is just like that other word, my doctrine is not mine own, for what a man has not from himself, but from God, that he ought to call not so much his own as God's. For no man hath the truth which he teaches, or the righteous will which he exercises from himself, but from God. Since Christ came to do not his own will, but his Father's, because the righteous will which he had was not from his human, but from his divine nature. But that God spared not his own Son, but delivered him for us all, is nothing else than that he did not rescue him. We find many instances of this sort in Holy Scripture. Again, where he says, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. And if this cup may not pass away from me, except I drink it, thy will be done. He signifies by his own will the natural desire for safety by which his human flesh shrank from the pain of death. But again, he speaks of his Father's will, not that the Father willed the death of the Son rather than his life, but that the Father willed that the human race should not be restored unless man should do some act as great as was that death. And because reason did not require that of him which no one else could do, therefore the Son says he willed his own death, since he chose rather to suffer it than that the human race should not be saved, as though he were to say, since thou willest not that the reconciliation of the world should be accomplished in any other way, I say that thou in this way willest my death. Let thy will then be done. That is, let my death take place, so that the world might be reconciled to thee. For we often say that a man wills a thing because he does not will another thing, which if he did, what he is said to will would not take place, as when we say that a man is willing to put out the candle when he will not shut the window through which the wind comes in, which puts out the candle. Thus, when the Father willed the death of the Son, because he willed that the world should only be saved by man doing some act as great as I have just mentioned, as this was to the Son who willed the salvation of men, since no other man was able to do it, the same as if the Father had commanded him to die, and hence, as the Father gave him commandment, even so he did. And the cup which the Father gave him he drank, being obedient even unto death. It may be also rightly understood that by that pious will of his, by which the Son was willing to die for the salvation of the world, the Father gave him, not however compulsorily, the commandment and the cup of his passion, that by it also he spared him not, but gave him up for us, and willed his death, and that the Son himself became obedient unto death, and learned obedience by the things which he suffered. For like as, according to his human nature, he had not the will to live righteously from himself, but from the Father, so also that will by which, in order to do us a great good, he willed to die. For he could not have had but from the Father of lights, from whom cometh every good and perfect gift. And as the Father is said to draw by giving the will to come, it is not an improper expression, if he be asserted to impel. For as the Son saith of the Father, no man cometh to me, except the Father draw him. So he might have said, except the Father impel him. Similarly, he might have shown, no man hasteneth to death for my name's sake, except the Father hath impelled him, or drawn him. Since every man is drawn or impelled by his own will to do that which he undeviatingly wills, God is not inaptly said to draw or impel when he gives such a will, though in his drawing or impelling no violent necessity is understood, but a willing and loving holding fast to the good will which has been received. If then it cannot be denied that in this manner the Father, by the gift of that good will, did draw or impel the Son to death, who does not perceive that by this means he gave him the commandment to undergo death willingly, and that he gave him the cup which he drank not unwillingly? And if the Son be rightly said to have spared not himself, but of his own free will to have given himself up for us, who can say that it is not rightly said that the Father, from whom he had this will, spared him not, but gave him up for us, and willed his death? Thus also was it by unwaveringly and unwillingly keeping the will he received from the Father that the Son was made obedient to him, even unto death, and learned from the things which he suffered obedience. That is, how great things may be done by obedience. For then only is there true and unfeigned obedience, when a reasonable nature, not by necessity, but of its own accord, keeps the will received by it from God. We may also in various other ways understand how it was that the Father willed the death of the Son, although what have been mentioned may suffice. For as we say that he wills a thing who causes another to will it, so also we say that he wills a thing who, though he does not cause another will it, yet approves of him because he wills it. As for instance, when we see a man bravely suffer misfortune in order that he may accomplish a good end which he wills, Although we confess that we wish him to bear that penalty, yet we do not wish or love the penalty he undergoes, but his will to undergo it. He also, who can forbid a thing taking place, and does not, we are accustomed to say, wills what he does not forbid. Since, therefore, the will of the Son was pleasing to the Father, and he did not forbid him either to have that will or to perform what he willed, it is rightly affirmed that he willed that the Son should undergo death so pious and so beneficial in its results, although he did not love the penalty itself which he incurred. Again, he said that the cup which could not pass from him except he drank it, not that he could not have avoided death if he had wished, but since, as has been said, it was impossible for the world to be saved by any other means, he unwaveringly wished rather to suffer death than that the world should not be saved. But the reason why he said those words was to teach us that the human race could not be saved in any other way than by his death, and not to show that he counted as of no consequence the avoiding of death. Whatever things like these which have been mentioned are said of him are thus to be explained, so that he may be understood to have died not from any necessity, but of his own free will. For he was almighty, and of him it is written that he was offered because he himself willed it. And he says himself, I lay down my life, that I may take it again. No man taketh from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. Therefore, what he does by his own power and by his own will, he can by no means be rightly said to be compelled to do.
This one point, though, that God permitted him, even though willing, to be so treated, does not seem a mode of dealing befitting such a father with such a son.
Nay, on the contrary, it is most befitting such a father to consent to such a son in his will to do an act that shall redound to the honor of God, and prove the cause of the salvation of man, which could not be accomplished any other way.
On this point we are as yet at issue, namely, how can it be shown that that death was reasonable or necessary? Since if it were not, it seems that it would neither have been right for the Son to have willed it, nor for the Father to have required or permitted it. The question, therefore, is, why could not God have saved man in some other way? Or if he could, why did he will this way? Now it not only seems befitting God to have saved man in this way, but also it does not appear of what avail that death was for the salvation of man. For it is a strange thing for God so to delight in, or stand in need of, the blood of an innocent person, as that without his being slain he would not, or could not, spare the guilty.
Since in this question you accept the position of those who will believe nothing before it has been demonstrated by reason, I will make this compact with you, namely that none, not even the least unfitness of or contradiction, be allowed by us to have place in God, and also that no reason, not even the weakest, unless a stronger oppose it, be rejected. For as any unfitness or contradiction, however small, with God involves impossibility, so any reason, however small, unless it be contradicted by a greater, involves necessity.
Most willingly do I accept this compact to be observed by both of us in this matter.
The question is then only of the incarnation of God, and of the things which we believe of him after he became man.
It is so.
Let us suppose then that the incarnation of God and the things we say of him as man had never taken place. And let it be agreed between us that man was formed for blessedness, which cannot be had in this life. Also that no one can attain to that blessedness, but after forgiveness of his sins, that no man can pass through this life without sin, and that some faith in these things is necessary to eternal salvation.
Be it so, for nothing in this appears unfitting God or impossible to God.
The remission of sins then is necessary to man, in order that he may attain to blessedness.
So we all hold.
We must therefore inquire for what reason God does forgive men their sins. And that we may make this more clear, let us first see what it is to sin, and what it is to make satisfaction for sin.
It is your place to explain, and mine to attend.
If either angel or man had always rendered to God what they owed, they would neither have ever sinned.
I cannot say anything to the contrary.
To sin, therefore, is nothing else than not to render to God his due.
But what is that debt which is due from us to God?
The entire will of a rational creature ought to be subject to the will of God.
True enough.
This is the debt which both angel and man owe to God, as long as he pays, which no one sins. And everyone who does not pay this sins. This is righteousness or rectitude of will, which makes us just or right in his sight, that is, in will. This is the sole and entire honor which we owe to God and which God requires of us. For such a will, when it can be exercised alone, does works well pleasing to God, because without it no work is pleasing to him. He who does not render to God this honor which is due to him robs God of what is his own, and dishonors God, and this is what it is to sin. Moreover, so long as he does not pay that of which he has robbed him, he continues in his fault. So it is not enough to restore God what only that he has taken away, but he ought also to make amends for the insult done to God, to restore more than he took away. For it is not sufficient for one who injures the health of another to restore him to that health, unless he also makes some amends for the injury he has done by causing him pain. So he who wrongs the honor of anyone does not do enough when he restores his honor, unless, according to the mischief done by dishonoring him, he restores something to please him which he has dishonored. It must also be noticed that when a man pays what he has taken away unjustly, he ought to give what could not have been required of him, had he not stolen what was another. So therefore it is everyone who sins bound to pay back the honor of that of which he has robbed God. And so this is the satisfaction which every sinner is bound to make to God.
Boso, to all this, as we agreed to follow reason, I have nothing to object, although you somewhat terrify me.
Let us go back to the subject and see whether it would be fitting for God to remit sins by mercy alone, without any payment of the debt.
I do not see why it would not.
To forgive sin, thus, is simply not to punish it, and since it is rightly ordered that sin without satisfaction only exists to be punished, if it be not punished, it is remitted out of order.
What you say is reasonable.
But it is not fitting for God to remit anything out of order in his kingdom.
I fear I shall be guilty of sin if I even wished to contradict that.
Therefore, it is not fitting for God to remit sin thus unpunished, for when God would be regarding as alike one who sins and one who does not, which is not consistent with God.
I cannot deny it.
Note this also: everyone who knows the righteousness of man to be under some law, so that it may be recompensed with a measure of reward according to its quantity more or less.
So we believe.
But if sin is neither atoned for nor punished, it is subject to no law.
I cannot otherwise suppose it.
Therefore, unrighteousness, if it be remitted by mercy alone, is more free than righteousness, which seems very inconsistent. Nay, this inconsistency extends further, even to this, that it makes unrighteousness to be like God, because as God is subject to no law, so likewise is unrighteousness.
I cannot resist your reasoning, but when God commands us to forgive altogether those who sin against us, it seems a contradiction that he should command us to do this which is not fitting for him to do himself.
There is no contradiction in this, because God commands us this in order that we may not presume upon what belongs to God alone. For to take vengeance belongeth to none but to him who is the Lord of all, since when earthly powers do this rightly, it is God himself, by whom they are ordained for this very thing, who does it.
You remove the contradiction which I thought existed. You have removed the contradiction which I thought existed. But there is another point on which I wish to have your answer. Namely, since God is so free as to be subject to no law and no one's judgment, and yet so kind as that nothing more kind can be conceived than he is, and since nothing is right or proper but what he wills, it seems strange for us to say that he by no means wishes, or that it is not lawful for him to forgive injury done to himself, when it is from him that we are accustomed to ask forgiveness of those offences we commit against others.
It is true what you say of his freedom and of his will and of his kindness, but we ought so reasonably to understand these, as not to seem to militate against his dignity. For with him there is no freedom, but to do what is expedient or what is fitting. Neither is that to be called his kindness which brings to pass anything unbefitting God. But in that it is said that what he wills is just, and what he wills not is not just. This is not to be understood as though if God were to will anything inconsistent, it would be just because he willed it. For if God were to will to lie, it does not follow that it is just to lie, but rather that he who so wills is not God. For to will to lie can in no way be the will of anyone, except that will in which truth is corrupted, nay, which is truth by forsaking truth, which is corrupted by forsaking truth. When therefore it is said, if God were to will to lie, it is the same thing as saying, if God were of a nature that would will to lie. Consequently, it does not follow that falsehood is just, unless it be understood like as when we say of two impossible things, if this, then that is, when neither this nor that really are, as if one were to say, if water is dry, then also fire wet. For neither is true. So also it is only true to say, if God wills this, it is just of those things which it is not consistent for God to will. For if God will it to rain, it is just that it should rain. And if God wills a man to be slain, it is just that he should be slain. Wherefore, if it be not fitting for God to do anything unjustly or out of order, it does not belong to his freedom or his kindness or his will to let go unpunished the sinner who does not pay that of which he has robbed God.
You have removed all that I thought could be objected against you.
Mark now why it would not be right for God to do this.
I am all attention to what you say.
Nothing is less tolerable in the order of things than that a creature should rob his Creator of the honor due to him, and not repay him that of which he robs him.
That is quite clear.
But if nothing is less tolerable than a thing, nothing can be more unjustly tolerated.
This too is obvious.
I suppose then you will not say that God ought to tolerate that than which nothing can be more unjust to tolerate, namely that a creature should not repay God that to which he robs him.
I see this is undeniable.
Also, if nothing be more great or good than God, nothing can be more just than that which preserves his honor in the disposing of events, even the supreme justice, which is nothing else than God himself.
Nothing can be clearer than this too.
There is nothing then that God would preserve with greater justice than the honor of his own dignity.
I must allow this to be true.
Does it seem to you that he would preserve it intact, if he so allowed it to be taken from him, as that neither it should be restored, nor he who robs him of it be punished?
I dare not say he would.
It is necessary then either that the honor taken from him should be repaid, or that punishment should follow. Otherwise, God would either not be just to himself, or else would be impotent to exact either demand, which is horrible even to imagine.
I see that nothing can be said with greater reason. But I would hear from you whether the punishment of the sinner be an honor to him, or if, what kind of honor? If the punishment of the sinner be not an honor to him, since the sinner does not pay what he had taken away, but is punished, God loses his honor, so as not to regain it, which seems to contradict what has been said.
That God should lose his own honor is impossible, for either the sinner of his own will pays what he owes, or God takes it from him against his will. For either man of his own free will exhibits that subjection to God which is due from him, either by not sinning or by making amends for his sin, or else God subjects him to himself by tormenting him against his will, and by this means shows himself to be his Lord, which the same man refuses of his own will to acknowledge. In this it must be remarked that, like as man by sinning takes away what is God's, so God by punishing takes away what is man's. For not only is that said to be a man's own, which he already possesses, but also that which is so far in his power as that he may have it. Therefore, since man was so formed that he might have had blessedness, if he had not sinned, for when for his sin he is deprived of blessedness and of all good, he pays out of his own property, although against his will, what he took away, because though God does not transfer what he deprives him of to his own use and advantage, as a man turns to his own use the money which he takes from another, yet that which he deprives him of, he does use for his honor, by the very fact of depriving him of it. For by depriving him of it, he proves that the sinner and all that he has are subject to himself.
I agree with what you say, but there is another question which I ask you to answer for me. Namely, if God ought, as you prove, to preserve his honor, why does he suffer it to be violated even a little? For in that it is suffered to be injured in any way, it is not kept intact or perfect.
Nothing, as far as itself is concerned, can be added to or diminished from the honor of God. For his honor is, like himself, incorruptible and in no way liable to change. But when any single creature preserves the order which is its own, or is as it were prescribed to it, whether by instinct or reason, it is said to obey God and to pay him honor. And this especially with a reasonable creature, to whom it is given to know what it owes to God. And this creature, when its will is to do what it ought, honors God. Not that it confers any favor on him, but that of its own accord it submits itself to his will and disposing, and preserves its own order in the universe, and as far as in it lies the beauty of the same universe. And when it does not will what it ought, it does, as far as it is concerned, dishonor to God, in that it does not submit itself to its own accord to his disposing, and disturbs, as far as it can, the order and beauty of the universe, although it can by no means injure or disfigure the power or dignity of God. For although those bodies which are contained in the circle of heaven were to will not to be under heaven, or to depart from the heavens, yet they could by no means be anywhere but except heaven. Nor could they escape from heaven except by approaching heaven. For whensoever they might come, or whithersoever they might go, or howsoever they might go, they will still be under heaven. So much the farther as they might depart from one quarter of the heavens, so much the nearer they would approximate to the opposite quarter. So although men or an evil angel be unwilling to submit to the will and ordinance of God, yet he cannot escape from it, because if he will flee from the will of God commanding him, he comes under the will of God punishing him. And if you ask how he passes from one to the other, it is only by the will of God permitting him. And this very thing, his willing or acting perversely, supreme wisdom converts to the order and beauty of the above-mentioned universe. For the spontaneous satisfaction of perversity, or the exaction of punishment from him who does not make satisfaction, except that God in many ways brings good out of evil, hold each their own in the same universe, and preserve the beauty of its order. Moreover, if the divine wisdom had not added this condition, when perversity strikes to disturb the right order, there would have been in the very universe which God ought to order a certain deformity arising from the violated beauty of its order, and God would seem to have been wanting in his disposing of things, and since these two things are an inconsistency, so they are impossible, and hence it is necessary that every sin must be followed either by satisfaction or punishment.
You have satisfied my objection.
It is evident then that no one can either honor or dishonor God, as he is in himself. But as far as in him lies, anyone seems to do so when he submits to or withdraws from his own will from God's will.
I know not how to contradict this.
I will add yet something else.
Say on till I am tired of listening.
It is agreed that God proposed out of human nature, which he had made without sin, to restore the number of the angels who had fallen.
We believe this, but it would have some reason for this fact.
You deceive me, for we propose to treat only of the incarnation of God, and now you bring in other questions for me to answer.
Do not be angry, for God loveth a cheerful giver, and no one proves that he gives cheerfully when he promises so completely as he who gives more than he promises. Tell me therefore freely what I ask.
We take it then as undoubtedly true that the rational nature, which either is or is to be blessed with the enjoyment of God, is foreknown by God to be of a certain rational and perfect number, so that it can neither be greater nor less. This is certain, for either God does not know in what number it would best be constituted, which is false, or if he knows, he constitutes it in that number which he knows to be most fit for this end. Whether either those angels who fell were made so as to be within this number, or because they exceeded it, were unable to persevere and fell of necessity, which is an absurd thing to be imagined.
The truth of what you say is apparent. Since then,
they ought to have been of that number, either their number must of necessity be restored, or the rational creature will remain in an imperfect number, though it was foreknown to exist in a perfect number, which cannot be.
Undoubtedly this must be restored.
There must be then from human nature, they must then be from human nature, for there is no other nature from which they can be restored.
Why could not either of these very ones or other angels have been restored in their place?
When you see the difficulty of our own restoration, you will understand the impossibility of their reconciliation. Again, other angels could not be restored in their place, for, not to speak of how this would seem to militate against the perfection of the first creation, it would not be right for them to be so, unless they could be such as these would have been had they not sinned. For those would have persevered without having seen any vengeance taken for sin, and this after their fall would be impossible for others who were to be restored in their place. For those who know nothing of the punishment of sin, and they who being continually its eternal punishment, cannot be equally worthy of praise for standing in the truth. Now it is not by any means to be supposed that the good angels were confirmed by the fall of the evil, but by their own merit. For as the good, if they had sinned with the evil, would have been condemned together with them, so the unrighteous, had they remained steadfast with the just, would have been equally confirmed in grace. For if some of them were to be confirmed only by the fall of others, either none would ever be confirmed, or it would be necessary that one should fall, who should be punished for the sake of the confirmation of the others, both of which are absurd. Therefore, they who stood were confirmed in that manner, in which all would have been confirmed had they stood which manner I have shown, as I was able, when I treated upon the reason why God did not give perseverance to the devil.
You have proved that the evil angels must be made up for out of human nature, and it is plain from this reasoning that the elect of man are not in the smaller number than are the reprobate angels. But show, if you can, whether they will be greater or not.
It is agreed then that God purposed to make up out of men for the angels who had fallen.
Certainly.
These men, who are to be taken up into that heavenly city in the places of the angels, must be there in the same state as those angels would have been whose place they are to take. That is, in the same as the good angels are now. Otherwise, those who fell would not be restored. And it would follow either that God could not perfect the good work which he began, or that he repented of having begun so great a good work, both of which are absurd.
True, it is necessary then that men should be equal to the good angels.
Have the good angels ever sinned?
No.
Can you conceive then that a man who has once sinned and has never made satisfaction to God for his sin, but is only suffered to go unpunished, should be equal to an angel who has never sinned?
I might conceive and speak of these words, but I cannot conceive of such a meaning for them, just as I cannot understand falsehood to be truth.
It is not then consistent with God to take man who is a sinner without satisfaction, to make up for the lost angels, since truth does not suffer him to be raised to equality with the good angels.
So reason shows us.
Consider again, in the case of man alone, setting aside that he ought to be equal with the angels, whether it would be consistent for God to exalt him as he is to any blessedness, even such as he had before he sinned.
Say what you think, and I will consider it as well as I can.
Let us suppose a rich man holds in his hand a precious pearl, which no pollution has ever touched, and which no one could move out of his hand unless he allowed it. He purposes to lay it up in his treasury, where are the most choice and precious things he has.
I conceive this as if it were before our eyes.
What if he were to allow, though he might have prevented, some envious person to shake this same pearl out of his hand into the mire, and afterward were to take it up out of the mire, all polluted and unwashed as it was, and were to lay it up in some clean and choice place of his, and were henceforth to keep it thus? Would you think him in his senses?
How could I? For it would not have been much better for him to hold and keep his pearl clean than polluted.
Would not God be acting in a like manner who kept man in paradise, as in his own hand, in the society of sinless angels, and permitted the devil, moved with envy, to cast him down, though with his own consent, into the mire of sin? For if he had willed to prevent the devil tempting him, he could not have tempted man. Would he not, I say, be acting like this rich man, if he were to restore man stained with the filthiness of sin, without any cleansing, that is, without any satisfaction, and he were to remain for ever even in the paradise from which he was expelled?
If God were to act thus, I dare not deny the similarity, and therefore I do not allow that he could act thus. For it would seem as though either he could not do what he had purposed to do, or else that he repented of his good purpose, which cannot happen with God.
Hold it, therefore, as a most certain truth that without satisfaction, that is, without the willing payment of the debt, God cannot let the sinner go unpunished, nor can the sinner attain to blessedness, even such as he had before he sinned. For were it so, man would not be restored even such as he was before his sin.
I cannot altogether contradict your reasoning, but how is it that we say to God, "Forgive us our debts," and all people who believe in God pray him to forgive them their sins? Now if we pay what we owe, why do we pray him to forgive us? Is God so unjust as to require over again what has been paid? But if he does not pay what we owe, why do we pray him in vain to do that, since it is inconsistent with his nature, he cannot do?
He who does not pay in vain says, "Forgive." But he who does pay beseeches, for it is a very part of his payment to beseech. For God owes nothing to anyone, but every creature owes to him. And so it is not proper for man to deal with God as equal with equal. But on this point, I need not answer to you. For when you see why Christ died, you will perhaps see what you want yourself.
What you have answered on this question is enough for me at present. But that no man can attain to blessedness with sin upon him, or can be freed from sin unless he pays that of which he has robbed God by sinning, you have so clearly demonstrated that even if I would, I could not doubt.
You will not, I suppose, doubt this also, that it is necessary for salvation to be according to the measure of the sin.
Were it not so, sin would remain in some sort out of order, which cannot be if God has left nothing out of order in his kingdom, and we have agreed that the smallest inconsistency in God is impossible.
Tell me then, what will you repay God for your sin?
I will give him repentance, a contrite heart, humility, self-denial, and various works of the body, also mercy in giving and forgiving, and I will give him obedience.
What do you really give to God in all these things?
What? Do not I honor God when, for fear and love of him, in the sorrow of my heart, I renounce temporal pleasures, and by my self-denial and earnest labors, trample underfoot the delights and eases of this life? When I am bountiful of my goods in giving away and forgiving what is owed to me, and for when I subject myself in obedience to him?
When you render a thing which you owe to God, even if you have not sinned, you ought not to count this as the debt which you owe for your sin. Now all these things which you mention, you owe to God anyway. For such love as you mentioned, you owe to him in this mortal life, and also to this belongs prayer, the desire of attaining the end for which you were made, sorrow because you have not yet attained it, and fear lest you should not attain to it, so that it is your duty not to feel any pleasure but in what you give, but what gives you either help or attain or hope of attaining that end. For you do not desire to have what you do not love, and desire without a fervor in proportion to its value, and about which you do not grieve that you have not yet got it, and are as yet in such jeopardy whether you will have it or no. To the attaining of this you also must avoid ease, and the pleasures of the world which call away the mind from that true repose and delight, except so far as you see they apply you with inducements to attain that happiness. Again, as to your bounty, you ought to consider that you do it as a debt, as you well know that what you give you have not from yourself, but from him whose servant you are, and also he to whom you give. And nature teaches you to do to your fellow servant, that is one man to another, what you would he should do to you, and that he who will not give what he has no right to receive what he has not. And then, as to forgiveness, I say in brief that vengeance by no means belongs to you, as we have said before, since neither are you your own, nor is he who has done the injury either yours or his own. But you are both servants of one Lord, and were created by him out of nothing. And if you avenge yourselves upon your fellow servant, you are proudly presuming upon that judgment which belongeth only to the Lord and Judge of all. Again, your obedience, what do you give to God which is not his due from you, to which command you owe all that you are, and have, and are capable of?
I dare not now say that in these things I give God anything which I do not owe him anyway.
What will you then repay God for your sin against him?
If myself or whatever I can do, even when I do not sin, I owe to him on pain of sinning, I have nothing to repay him for my past sin.
What will then become of you? How can you be saved?
If I consider your reasoning, I do not see how. But if I have recourse to my faith, by Christian faith which worketh by love, I hope I may be saved. For it is written, If the wicked will turn from all his sins that he hath committed, and will do that which is lawful and right, all his transgressions shall be forgotten. Ezekiel 18:22 and 21 and 22.
This is only said to those who either looked for Christ before he came or believe in him after he has come. But we suppose Christ and Christian faith as though they had never been, when we propose to inquire by reason alone whether his coming were necessary to the salvation of men.
So we did.
By reason alone, then let us proceed.
Well, though you lead me into some difficulties, yet I desire greatly that as you have begun, you should go on.
Let us take for granted all these things which you supposed just now, that you are able to make payment for your sin, and that you owed no debt to God before. And let us see whether it can suffice for satisfaction for one sin, so small as is a single look contrary to the will of God.
If I did not hear you put this in question, should I have thought this sin to be blotted out by one single prick of conscience?
Have you not yet considered of what a grievous weight sin is?
Well, show it me now.
If you were to see yourself in the presence of God, and someone were to say to you, "Look this way," and God on the other hand were to say, "I will by no means have you look," ask yourselves in your own heart, what is there in all existing things, for the sake of which it would be right for you to give that look contrary to the will of God?
I do not find anything for the sake of which it would be right for me to do it, unless perhaps I were placed in such a necessity as that I must either do this or some greater sin.
Take away this necessity, and consider the case of this sin alone. Might you do it for your own redemption?
I see clearly that I might not.
Well, not to tire you any longer, but what if it were necessary, either that the whole world and whatever is not God should perish and be reduced to nothing, or that you should do so small an action contrary to the will of God?
When I consider the action itself, I see it to be a very trifling thing, but when I look what it is to do to do it contrary to the will of God, I perceive it to be a very grievous thing, and not to be put in comparison with any damage that might occur. But one sometimes acts contrary to the will of another without doing wrong, and in order that his property might be preserved, and he is afterwards pleased that we acted contrary to his will.
This is the case with man, who sometimes does not perceive what is profitable for him, or who cannot restore what he has lost, but God stands in need of no one, and he could, if he were to perish, restore all things just as he created them.
I must confess, then, even for the preservation of the whole creation, I should have no right to act contrary to the will of God.
What if there were more worlds full of creatures like this is?
But if they were multiplied to an infinite number and were put before me in like manner, I should make the same answer.
Well, you could do nothing better. But consider again, suppose it were to happen that you did give the look contrary to the will of God. What could you do to make amends for this sin?
I have nothing more than what I mentioned above.
Well now, we sin thus grievously as often as we knowingly do anything, however small, contrary to the will of God. For we are always in his presence, and he always commands us not to commit sin.
I understand you will live in a very perilous state.
It is clear that God requires satisfaction according to the amount of sin.
I cannot deny that.
You do not therefore make satisfaction if you do not repay something greater than that, for the sake of which you would have no right to commit the sin.
Yes, I see that reason so requires it, and also that it is quite impossible for me to do so.
And that God cannot receive into blessedness anyone who is in any wise bound by the debt of sin.
This sentence is too heavy.
Listen again to another reason for which it is equally difficult for man to be reconciled to God.
If faith were not to console me, this alone would drive me to despair.
Yet listen.
Say on.
Man in paradise, created without sin, was as it were, put forward on God's behalf between God and the devil, in order that he might overcome the devil by refusing to consent to his persuading him to sin, for the vindication and honor of God, and for the confusion of the devil. In that man was a weaker nature, man of weaker nature and on earth should not sin at the persuasion of the same devil, who of a stronger nature and in heaven did sin with no one to persuade him. And though man might easily have effected this purpose of God, since he was not compelled to sin by any force, still in spite of all this, at mere persuasion he allowed himself to be overcome by the wile of the devil, and this against the will and honor of God.
What are you aiming at?
Judge for yourselves. Judge for yourself. If it be not contrary to the honor of God that man should be reconciled to him with the charge of this affront still upon him, unless he shall first have retrieved the honor of God by overcoming the devil, like as he dishonored him by being overcome by the devil. Moreover, the victory ought to be such that even as when strong and with the power of being immortal, he easily consented to the devil to sin, and thereby justly incurred the penalty of becoming mortal, so weak and mortal as he had made himself, so he by the hard way of death overcame the devil, so in no way to commit sin. And this he cannot do as long as from the wound of that original sin he is conceived and born in sin.
Again, I say that reason also approves what you say, and it is impossible.
Take yet one more condition, without which man may not with justice be reconciled, and one no less impossible than the others.
You have already laid so many things which we are bound to do, and whatever more you superadd, you cannot increase my terror.
Listen, however.
I do.
What was that of which man robbed God when he was allowed himself to be overcome by the devil?
Do you say as you have begun? For I am at a loss to know what more he could add beyond those evils which you have shown me.
Did he not rob God of some end which he had purposed to effect out in human nature?
Undeniably he did.
Regard it then in strict justice, and according to that judge whether man would make satisfaction to God for his sin, if he did not, by overcoming the devil, restore to God that of which, by allowing himself to be overcome by the devil, he robbed him. So that, even as by his being overcome by the devil plundered what was God's, and God lost it, in like manner by his overcoming the devil might lose, and God regain his own.
In strictness and justice, nothing else can be thought of.
And do you think that supreme justice can violate his justice?
I dare not suppose so.
Well then, it follows that in no other way has man the power to or right to receive from God what God purposed to give him, if he does not restore to God the whole of what he robbed him of, so that as through him God lost, in like manner through him God should regain what he had lost. And this cannot be otherwise accomplished than that as by being overcome the whole of human nature was corrupted, and as it were leavened by sin. And with sin God exalts no one to the perfection of that heavenly city, so by overcoming so many men might be justified from sin, as were to fill up that number to complete which man was created. But to do this is not in any way possible for man who is a sinner, since one sinner cannot justify another sinner.
Nothing is more just and nothing more impossible. But by all these things the mercy of God and the hope of man seem to be at an end as far as regards the blessedness for which man was made.
Wait a little yet.
What more have you?
If a man is called unjust who does not repay another man what he owes, much more is he unjust who does not repay God what he owes.
If he can and does not repay, he is truly unjust. But if he is unable, how is he unjust?
Perhaps there is no cause in him for his inability. He might come to some extent to be excused. But if in that very inability there is guilt, then as it does not lighten the sin, so neither does it excuse his not repaying his debt. For instance, if a man orders his servant to do some work and warns him against letting himself fall into a pit which he shows him, from which it would be impossible for him to get out, and yet that servant, despising his Lord's command and warning, of his own accord, lets himself fall into the pit which he had been shown of him beforehand, so that he is altogether unwilling to do the work ordered him, do you think that this inability would in any way suffice for an excuse for his not doing the work ordered him?
By no means, but rather it would be an aggravation of his guilt, because he created that inability for himself. In fact, he sinned doubly, in that what he was commanded to do, he did not, and also what he was enjoined not to do, he did.
So man, who of his own accord rendered himself liable to that debt which he cannot pay, and by his own fault let himself fall into this inability, so that he can neither pay what was due from him to God before his sin, namely to abstain from sinning, nor this which is due from him because he has sinned, he is thus without excuse. Moreover, his very inability is a fault, in that he had no business to have it. Nay, his business was not to have it. For it is a fault not to have what one ought. So is it also a fault to have what one ought not. Therefore, it is man's own fault that he has not that power which he received in order that he might avoid sin. So is it also his fault that he has that inability, in consequence of which he can neither preserve righteousness and avoid sin, nor repay what he owes for the sin he has committed. Besides, of his own accord, he did that by which he lost that power and fell into this state of inability. For it is the same thing not to have the power which one ought to have, and to have that inability which one ought not to have. Therefore, the inability to repay God what he owes, which inability makes him not to repay it, does not excuse man for not repaying it, since the result of sin does not excuse the sin which produces that result.
It is a very grievous thing, and yet it must be so.
The man therefore is unjust who does not repay God what he owes.
It is too true, for he is unjust in not paying, and he is unjust in not being able to pay.
But no unjust man will be admitted to blessedness, since as that blessedness is complete in which there is no want, so it is fit for none but him in whom righteousness is so pure that there is no unrighteousness in him.
I did not believe otherwise.
He therefore who does not pay God what he owes cannot be beatified.
No, I must admit this consequence.
But if you insist upon saying that a merciful God who forgives the suppliant what he owes on the account that he is unable to pay the debt, he can only be said to forgive him either that which man ought to pay of his own accord, and cannot, that is, what may make amends for the sin which ought not to have been committed, or even for the preservation of everything that is not God, or else that which by punishing him he was about to take from him against his will, that is, as I said before, blessedness, which he would otherwise have enjoyed. Now, if it be true that God does forgive what man ought to pay of his own accord, just because he cannot do so, what else is it that than that God remits what he cannot get? And it is a mockery to attribute such a kind of mercy to God. But on the other hand, if God remits what he was about to exact from man against his will on account of his inability to pay what he ought to pay of his own accord, then God relaxes the punishment due to sin and makes man blessed on account of his sin, namely because he has what he ought not to have. For that the very inability he ought not to have, and consequently as long as he has it without making satisfaction for it, it is sin to him. But divine mercy of such a kind as this is exceedingly contrary to his justice, which allows of nothing but a penalty to be paid for sin. Wherefore, as it is impossible for God to be contrary to himself, so is it impossible for God to be merciful after such a manner as this.
I see that another kind of mercy than this must be looked for in God.
Let it be true that God forgives him who does not pay on the account that he cannot pay.
So I wish to have it.
But so long as he does not pay, he either wishes to pay or does not wish. If he cannot do what he wishes, he would be needy. But if he does not wish, he would be unjust.
This is very evident.
since whether he be needy or unjust, in neither case will he be blessed.
This too is clear.
So long then as he does not pay, he will be incapable of being blessed.
If God follows reason in his justice, there is no way by which such a miserable wretch of a man may escape, and the mercy of God seems to be at an end.
You've asked for reasoning, now abide by reasoning. Do not deny God to be merciful, who saveth both man and beast, as he hath multiplied his mercies. But we are speaking of that last act of mercy by which all after this life he makes man blessed. Now that this blessedness ought not to be given to any but to him whose sins are entirely remitted, and that this remission ought not to be granted except when the debt which is owing for sin, and which is in proportion to the greatness of the sin, is paid. All this I think I have, by the arguments stated above, proved with sufficient clearness. If you think any objection can be made to these arguments, you ought to say so.
Indeed, I do not see how the weight of any one of your arguments can in any degree be weakened.
Nor do I think they can, if they be well considered. But yet, if even one of all the arguments I've brought forward to be established by infallible truth, it ought to be enough to prove our point. For if a truth be infallibly demonstrated, whether by one argument or many, it is equally secured against all doubt.
I see, so it is. How then is man to be saved if he does not pay what he owes, and yet cannot be saved if he does not pay? Or with what face can we assert that God, who is rich in mercy beyond man's understanding, cannot do this act of mercy?
You ought to ask this of those who do not believe that Christ is necessary to the salvation of man, in whose place you are speaking, that they may tell you how man can be saved without Christ. But if they cannot do so in any way, then let them cease scoffing at us, and let them come and join themselves to us, who do not doubt that man can be saved through Christ, or else let them despair of its being possible for it to be done in any way at all. If they shrink from this, let them with us believe in Christ, that they may be saved. I would ask of you, as I did at first, to show me in what way man may be saved through Christ. Oh, wait, I need to read that again.
I would ask of you, as I did at first, to show me in what way man may be saved through Christ.
Is it not sufficiently proved that a man may be saved by Christ, when even unbelievers do not deny that man may in some way be made blessed? And it has been made sufficiently clear that if we suppose Christ not to have been, in no way can the salvation of man be found, for man must either be saved by Christ or by someone else, or else in no way at all. Wherefore, if it be untrue that this cannot be done in any way, or that it can by any other means, it must of necessity be done by Christ.
If a man sees the reason why it cannot be in any other way, and does not understand the reason why it must be Christ, but persists in asserting that it can be done neither by Christ nor by any other way, what answer shall we give him?
What answer must we give to the man who settles the thing which must of necessity be to be impossible, on the account that he does not know how it is?
That he had lost his senses.
Therefore no account is to be taken of what he says.
True, but we must show him this very thing, how that is which he thinks impossible.
Do you not perceive from what we said above that there must be of necessity be some men to attain blessedness? Now, if it be inconsistent for God to bring man to any sin upon him, to that state for which he created him without any spot at all, lest he should seem either to have repented of the good work which he began, or not to have been able to accomplish this purpose, much more is it on account of the same inconsistency possible that no man at all should be brought to that state for which he was created. Wherefore, we must either find, apart from the Christian faith, a satisfaction for sin, such as we have shown above ought to be made, and this no reasoning can discover, or we must undoubtingly believe that it is to be found in that faith. For that which by a chain of reasoning is shown to be necessarily true, ought not to be submitted to any doubting, even though the reason how it is so be not perceived.
What you say is true.
What more then do you require?
I did not come to you for the purpose of your removing for me doubts about the faith, but for to show me the reason of my certainty. Wherefore, as you have by strict reasoning brought the question down so far, as that I see that sinful man owes that to God for his own sin which he is unable to pay, and without his having paid he cannot be saved, in the same way I now wish you to lead me on further, so that by a necessary chain of reasoning I may understand how all those things which of necessity be true which the Catholic faith enjoins to believe concerning Christ, if we would be saved, so in what way they avail for the salvation of men, and how God in his mercy can save man, though he does not forgive him his sin, without his having paid the debt he has incurred by it. And that your arguments may be the more sure, do you so start from the first principles as to establish them on a firm foundation.
May God help me then, for you have no manner of mercy upon me, and do not consider the shallowness of my knowledge when you impose so great a work upon me. However, I will make the attempt, even as I began at first, with confidence, not in myself but in God, and I will do what with his help I can. But for fear I should weary anyone who may wish to read this by too long a continuation of the subject, we will distinguish what follows from what has been said by a new commencement. End of Book 1.